Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nicole Gurran. I'm Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Sydney, and I also direct the Henry Halloran Research Trust at the University of Sydney, which is a multidisciplinary research centre. So it crosses the University of Sydney and it focuses on bringing together the different bodies of knowledge within the university and beyond to look at how we solve the critical issues that face cities and regions in Australia and beyond. And one of the ways that we do that in dialogue with the community, with government, with industry and with researchers is through our annual Festival of Urbanism, which is why you're all here today. Now, the Festival of Urbanism is actually in its 10th year now, and it was conceived by the chair of today's session, who I'm about to introduce in a moment, Professor Peter Phibbs. But before I tell you a little bit more about the Festival of Urbanism and Peter, and hand over to begin the event today, I really want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional Munawinina people of this beautiful place that we know as Hobart. And I pay my respects to the traditional custodians of Hobart and Tasmania as well. And I also extend those respects to any Aboriginal people who may be in the audience with us today. So as I said, the Festival of Urbanism is now in its 10th year. It was conceived by my predecessor, the former director of the Henry Halloran Research Trust, Professor Peter Phibbs, as a kind of answer to the idea that governments make decisions about critical issues facing cities in isolation, perhaps with, the advice of a select cabal of experts and stakeholders in rooms with, doors that are closed and in ways that exclude the general public and people with actual experience and concerns and knowledge to share about their own places. And so the Festival of Urbanism was conceived as a place of bringing together experts from the research community with people from government, industry and the wider community. And this year we're taking it national. So for many years it's been a Sydney-based festival with a satellite series of events in Melbourne, but for the first time we're meeting now in Hobart, and this is actually the kick-off event for the Festival of Urbanism this year, and we're also going to Melbourne, Perth, Canberra and the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. Our festival events are of matters that are important globally, certainly nationally, but also deeply significant to the local community. And that's why I think today's event around Megaprojects is going to be a must-watch event for the people who'll be watching the recording of today's event, but also, as I understand it, very significant to people here in Hobart. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Professor Peter Phibbs. Let me just say a little bit about him. I hinted that he's a Professor Emeritus now. He worked for many, many years at the University of Sydney. We have called him, and I don't think it's unfair to say that he's probably the world's most popular. It's a bold claim, but I think you'll agree. I think you'll see why we make that claim by the end of today. The world's most popular urban planning professor. He is known internationally. He combines an absolutely ferocious intellect and expertise around urbanism, economic geography, housing. You will have seen him, in the news here in Hobart. Certainly we see him still popping up in the news very often in Sydney. But he combines that with his just absolute tremendous ability to communicate things of great importance to wide audiences. And so, look, with that, I'll hand him over to do that.
Whoa, big introduction. No, thanks very much. Yeah. It is great to be here. Before I start, could I also just pay my respects to the traditional and original owners of the land, the Mulwanina people, and pay respect to those that have passed before us, and acknowledge today's Tasmanian Aboriginal people who are the custodians of this land. Could also acknowledge we've got some elected councillors amongst us today. We've got Councillor Bill Harvey and Alderman Louise Bloomfield from Hobart City Council. Thanks very much for coming. And the Mayor of Clarence, Brendan Blumley, has also joined us. So thanks very much, Brendan. So let me just give you a little backstory about the first ever Festival of Urbanism back in 2014. Nicole's given you a bit of a picture, but it's quite an interesting story. The government was looking at redeveloping a site called the Base Precinct in Sydney, which was the site of an old power station, a lot of government land. They had a government group that was coordinating that, and the minister announced that they were going to fly in experts from all over the world for a concentrated, strategic planning session. But they weren't going to invite any members of the public who were, pretty interested in what was going to happen at Base Precinct. And we talked to the government about it, and they said no, it's like an experts only sort of closed session. So we thought that's a pretty silly idea, trying to plan a part of a city. So we actually partnered with the City of Sydney, the council in Sydney, a bit like Hobart, the inner city council. And they helped fund the festival, and that was the first Festival of Urbanism, and the theme was Megaprojects. And we had a great time, and one of the things we did was we actually forced the government's hand, so they actually invited at the end 100 sort of hand-picked community members for their talk fest. I think we even got an invite, Nicole. And all I can remember about the event, the catering was fantastic. Well, almost as good as this, Nicole, but yeah, almost as good as this. The catering was fantastic, but it was a fairly disjointed event. A lot of the experts who were talking about it didn't seem to even know where the Base Precinct was, which made it a bit tricky. But anyway, when Nicole told me about the theme for this festival, which is sort of contested urbanism, the Festival of Contested Urbanism, you can't think of a more contested spot perhaps than Macquarie Point. So I was very enthusiastic about the idea of having the kick-off event in Hobart, and Jason from UTAS also was enthusiastic. So we sort of got the band together, and we're here today. So, and yeah, really appreciate you coming along. So what we're going to do, the way we're going to run the event today is we're going to hear short burst from each of the panellists, and I'll introduce the panellists in a second. And then there's an opportunity for you to ask some questions. Some people have already sent some questions in online when they registered, and we'll have a chance to talk about them. But let me begin by just sort of introducing the speakers today. So we're going to start off with Dr. Mike Harris, who's a senior lecturer from the University of New South Wales. Now, Mike, I'll confess, was my PhD student quite a few years ago, but Mike's PhD was on megaprojects, and he actually, I think it was a pretty good PhD to do. He spent a fair bit of time in Europe looking at megaprojects in Europe and compared them to Australian case studies, and we'll talk about that during this talk. But Mike's job is to try and set the scene about what we know about how to design and deliver a successful mega project. So Mike will start talking shortly. Next to me is Jason Byrne, who's the Professor of Urban Planning at UTAS. I'm sure he needs almost no introduction. You would have, anyone in Hobart would have heard of Jason or heard him speak at a number of planning events. And Jason's going to provide a little bit of a potted history of what has happened at Macquarie Point today, and also a little bit later reflect on some of his observations about Macquarie Point, perhaps versus other mega projects he knows about in Australia and elsewhere. Helen Burnett, who's a councillor from the City of Hobart, I'm sure, who needs no introduction. I'm sure she's very well known to everyone. Helen's a Greens councillor. Helen's going to talk a little bit about, and Mike will bring this point up in his talk, the connection between mega projects and local government. Local government who are sitting here designing and planning and operating this part of the city, how their interactions have been and what some potential might be on the site. And last but very much not least, we've got Deborah Burkhardt on the end. Now, Deborah is a very experienced urbanist in Sydney. She's worked for many of Australia's largest companies in that space, including Lendlease. She probably describes herself as someone that's managed large master plan projects almost for most of her career. And Deborah's, if you like, insights into the project are based on her role as a board member of the Macquarie Point Corporation, I think for 2 or 3 years from 2018. So Deborah's had a chance to, reflect on that, and I think there'll be some very interesting observations about what she saw. But anyway, without any further ado, could we invite Mike up to the stage, so as to speak,
Sure.
and tell us what you think about successful mega projects, and also what mega projects are for people in the audience who are probably wondering what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Nicole. Pleasure to be visiting Hobart to participate in this event, which means, of course, I'm not a local expert in what's actually happening here in Hobart or Macquarie Point. I'll give a quick talk, max 10 minutes, hopefully, with some slides. Firstly, just to give a definition of what is a mega project, what makes a mega project a mega project. Then I'll talk a bit about how examples of these projects that fit within that definition are beneficial for the host city, ideally. And then lastly, finish on through just a bit of governance of mixed-use mega projects. Okay, so basically they're big. There's no real size definition, like it doesn't have to be a certain size in terms of the site area or floor space. They can be up to 300 hectares, like this example in Copenhagen, down to half that, which is Hafen City in Hamburg, and some of you will be familiar with some of these projects. You might also see a trend of the types of sites that these projects often occupy: post-industrial, single ownership, government-owned sites. Melbourne Docklands, which is a similar size, who a lot of you are probably familiar with. Down to Barangaroo, so 22 hectares, so dropping in size again. And 11 hectares, Hudson Yards, so this isn't waterfront, but it is still a kind of infrastructural government-owned site. 9 hectares, which is the size, I believe, of Macquarie Point. And they do get a bit smaller than that. So you can see that there's a big range in size. Cost is, they kind of talk about them being, $1 billion or more. But these days, a single building can cost $1 billion. Certainly a stadium can cost $1 billion. So that's not really a key kind of thing. One of the really important factors that I want to mention here about mega projects is the idea that they're supposed to be trait making rather than trait taking. So that simply just means that the project has bigger impact than the site itself. The idea is that it creates traits for the broader city, or just impacts the structure of the city or society, and ideally in a positive way. So we're talking today about mixed-use mega projects, and they typically have these components: commercial, residential, cultural component, which can mean a whole number of things. Really often today, there's a competitive motivation around these projects. So, today the capital is very mobile, people are mobile, companies are mobile. So often cities see these sites as opportunities to try to attract some of that investment, wealth and activity. Very, very common. The question that I'm interested in my research is, can this kind of competitive agenda actually be reconciled with local issues? And I would say yes, and often it's actually the same thing. So now I'll touch on some examples, and I think it's just really important to remember here that some of these projects are massive, but the principles that I'm going to talk about are really, really scalable, okay, across different types of projects. So these are 2 examples that happened in Copenhagen at different times, and essentially the underlying premise for both of these projects to kick off, of course there's a whole range of benefits, was really to finance a public transport system for the city. So the first one happened at a time when Copenhagen was virtually bankrupt, and there was this major investment blocks. So there was an agreement made to basically develop government-owned land. It could be rezoned, and the government then constructed a delivery authority that then looked after the infrastructure, did the subdivision, and then sold individual lots so they're getting the greatest return that they can then go back and pay for the loans on the metro. So it's also just worth mentioning that the state government on these projects don't play any role in urban planning or design or approvals. A much smaller project that happened in New York, so I just mentioned a second ago, this is 11 hectares, but again, a really similar kind of thing with transport, this idea that, they have a slightly different financing mechanism, but the principle's the same, is that they rezone the site and basically development proceeds go to funding and expansion of that subway network in this case. And because it's on government-owned land, they maintain ownership and there's an ongoing revenue source for the MTA to look after their assets. If anyone's been to New York, you know their subways probably need quite a bit of work. And again, I think this was the first kind of subway extension in decades in New York. So often these sites are used as ways to kind of unblock funding streams to improve some sort of connectivity with the city. And again, in this case, state government doesn't really play a role in the urban planning, design, or approvals.
So when you say that, is it just done locally? Local government?
Local government.
Not federal, just local?
That's right, yep. And I'll mention that in a bit more detail in a second. Another big one is housing. So, these are kind of fundamental urban planning conditions, and now globally, it's just standard practice, very typical that these projects, government-owned land, have a significant proportion of affordable housing. Of course, there's housing crises at some level in all of these cities. So very, very typical. Interestingly, the cities with the highest percentage aren't the kind of welfare states of Europe, it's the US, in New York, San Francisco. And I've just kind of highlighted down there in the green and gold that we're not really bringing home any medals in the Australian context in terms of using these publicly owned sites to actually address housing affordability. And also just notice the hectare size. So huge range in size, down to 5 hectares, and still 20% plus affordable housing component. So that's the kind of examples where this idea of the competitive agenda actually ties into these local issues. This is just a report that came out last week in Sydney demonstrating just how the housing unaffordability issues is impacting Sydney's productivity and economic success. Congestion is another one that everyone really knows about. Congestion, how much it costs. It was a really explicit principle in the Danish examples why the federal government backed the loans, because from their perspective, to actually create a city that would attract companies and people, it just simply needed to be more efficient. And you can't do that with cars, so you need an efficient public transport system. I also thought it would be worth just mentioning today that often these big projects do have a significant kind of flagship building or institution. So some examples here might be a university expansion, Hamburg, the Philharmonic Playhouse Theatre, and then I've added a couple from West Kowloon in Hong Kong, because it's an interesting example. It was a cultural district, a cultural and arts district, and they made very early decisions to kind of bookend, to use that term, the site with a National Opera House and a National Museum of Contemporary Art, but projects that really enhance that urban condition of these really important waterfront sites that, remember, all of these kind of plug into the existing city centres essentially, and kind of opening up those sites right on the water, pretty spectacular, outward facing, well connected to the city. So the question then really is, that these projects can really address is, what are the deficits of the host city? Are there infrastructural deficits, social infrastructure, cultural facilities that have really been identified, and how can the site best address those known issues of the city? It's an open question for today. How are benefits achieved? Good governance. So now I'm just going to spend just a few slides kind of talking a little bit about some of my reflections on looking at these projects around the world, internationally, and here in Australia. So I'll probably touch on 3 points I think I've got in here. So one is just how important it is to actually maintain alignment with existing planning frameworks. often in Australian states, we kind of just drop all of that and kind of come up with a very unique kind of different system than what everybody else has to go through. And that's really important for a number of reasons. One is just consistency for investors, developers, business communities, resident communities. What flows on from that is the urge to try to avoid the breakdown of actual trust in the planning system. That idea of trust in the planning system was a big topic over the last few years in Sydney concerning a particular project, but also relationships, like how much bad blood can be created through these processes between government agencies, local governments and state governments, governments and communities. You know, if there's a perception that there's just a different set of rules for this project and there's not a fair kind of playing field that's going on here. And I think it's also important to remember that projects like this can actually act as a uniting kind of, or just unite a city rather than divide a city. You know, there is the opportunity for these places to become places that the citizens are actually proud of. So I won't go into much detail about this, but some of the examples I talked about earlier, they have their processes, just like we have our planning processes. So if there's a change, or even just to start with, you know, these projects need to go through public reviews, approvals by multiple city government agencies, and what we see in the other states, and I'm not sure exactly how it works here, but a minister kind of makes the call. Now that's really, really problematic. So the suggestion is don't have a minister who can override planning policy without reference to that. I mean, this is a big issue because, I mean, just, you know, if you're a developer and, you know, developer have their priorities about what to do, and that's fair. But you know that, you know, you've invested a massive amounts of money, and in order to, if there was a particular change that could then give you an additional $1 billion or whatever, and that there's basically one person that could make that change, and they don't have to refer to any planning policy or any other review body, what are you going to do? You're going to go knock on their door and have a chat, you know? I mean, it just kind of, it sets up a real problem with governance and due process that can be extremely damaging and take a long time to recover from. Local government leadership. So if you look all around internationally, continental Europe, Scandinavia, the US, it's actually local city governments that lead these projects. Typically, they have more sophisticated urban planning and design capabilities than a state government, who are more concerned with big regional issues. Local governments know their local communities. They know the grain of their city and how they need to connect into their city. So it's important that, you know, they're not just advisors either, that the delivery authority is actually owned jointly or a majority share, preferably, by the local government. And that if there's a board, that the local government should actually have a majority representation. And then it's legislated. So in the range of projects that I showed, that's actually how it works. There's legislation that very clearly sets this out, and the local government is really leading this process. So ideally, you know, you don't have a board that's handpicked by the minister, kind of for similar reasons. I mean, even just the perceived kind of chance of corruption is just, you know, bad governance. And just lastly, to touch on, let's take up too much space today, the idea of maintaining the role in government. So, you know, how do you provide leadership over time? And at the end of the day, you know, whose role is it to secure and ensure public benefit? You know, it's actually that's not the role of the private sector in development, really. So handing over, you know, large chunks of the city to private developers, you do really hand over the potential for these projects to achieve the city scale benefits that it could do. And it can result in conflicts of public interest. I mean, almost inevitably. So, and you can kind of see, you know, you can track this through multiple projects where over time, and they go for long periods of time, you know, the people that are leading these projects, they stop thinking about how the site connects with the rest of the city, how the facilities relate to other facilities in the city, and they just become really inward focused on developing that particular chunk of land. So that's probably the end for me, the main points I wanted to raise, and, you know, hopefully there's some relevance there for today's discussion.
Thanks very much, Mike. Great. So we've heard that big picture. I'll now invite Jason Byrne to probably going to make two contributions today. But firstly, just provide a bit of a potted history about what's actually gone on down at Macquarie Point so far. So, Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Peter and Nicole, for having me along today. Really appreciate it. So I'll try and keep this fairly short. I've got my cheat sheet here because it's quite a complex history when you start to unpack it.
Sure.
And it almost looks like it reinvents itself every few years as well. So back in 2012, the Minister for Infrastructure, Commonwealth and State agreed to redevelop Macquarie Point. And the Commonwealth gifted a $50 million grant to the state for this purpose. In 2012, an Act of Parliament was set up to create the Macquarie Point Development Corporation. That Act was gazetted in December 2012 and then was subsequently amended 2015, 18 and 20. In 2012, Peter, the vision was for a mixed-use precinct, much as we heard about before. A precinct of open space, of housing, a precinct that would have potentially art and cultural facilities and potentially even maybe some science purposes. The Macquarie Point Development Corporation only gained control of the site in September 2013. So there was already a lag there, and part of their job was also to refurbish and revitalise the Brook Street Pier, which they did, and did a pretty good job, and that was opened in January 2015. This is when things start to get a bit tricky though. The first master plan was launched by the Minister in June of 2015, and competitive bids from developers opened in December 2015, opened that year. In 2016, by May, there were expressions of interest that were shortlisted, and these expressions of interest from the public record were really strong. There was a lot of interest among the development community in redeveloping the site, and they got quite excited. The Tasmanian Planning Commission was, by April, meant to have made a decision on the development plan, and that stalled not once, but twice. And this is a bit of a story in Tasmania's planning history. In fact, you can look back across Tasmania's history and see it repeated, partly due to shortages in staff in the Planning Commission. All right, so in 2016, that same year as the expressions of interest were shortlisted, Mona was invited to submit a vision for the site. And it did, and it won a lot of community praise and wide accolades. It was to contain a truth and reconciliation park, and 50% of the site was going to be set up for open space, with a range of other functions on the site as well. In 2016, there were 20 stakeholder briefings on the development, and in December of that year, the Tasmanian government reset its vision for Macquarie Point. In 2018, the Act was amended to enable leasing of the site, and then not long after, we saw the Hobart Brewing Company start up in the goods shed, the heritage lifted goods shed in 2021. Okay, just to skip to the end, a cycleway is one of the big successes of the development to date. That was completed in 2018. In 2020, there was another vision reset though, and this time for a vision again of mixed use for the precinct. Key components were the protection of open space, ensuring the public transit corridor, the rapid transit corridor to the site was protected, and the heritage buildings on site were protected as well. There was again a call for expressions of interest in developing part of the site, and two proponents back in 2020 were ready to purchase part of the site. And around that same time, April 2020, there was pre-registration for development of the site. So let's skip forward now to where we are right now. In 2021, there was a set of urban design principles for the Truth and Reconciliation Park that were agreed upon, and firms were commissioned to undertake those urban design principles. $77 million was awarded to the Macquarie Point Redevelopment Corporation by the state government for site infrastructure. And then this brings us to the present moment, where in 2022, 2023, the Minister for Planning asked the Redevelopment Corporation to revise its plans. We all know that this was based around the AFL Stadium, and not long after, a community group launched its own alternative vision for the site because they were pretty disgusted by the vision that was offered up with the stadium and not much housing. So in a kind of nutshell, that's where we are at the moment, Peter.
Right, so quite a few strategic plans for the one site that you kept changing. But probably one of the reasons it's not too much has happened so far. So Helen, Mike discussed the importance of local government in the development of mega projects like Macquarie Point. Would you have any observations on the connection of Hobart City Council into the process?
Well, thanks, Peter, and it's great to be part of this panel, and I welcome everybody to Hobart. It's wonderful to have the festival here. The role of local government is as a planning authority, and currently, so still, the Sullivan's Cove planning scheme is where the Macquarie Point falls under. So theoretically, there is that opportunity to consider any sort of development at Macquarie Point under the Sullivan's Cove planning scheme. And we know there was a planning scheme amendment which covered the area of Macquarie Point. And it was a lot of that was around making sure that there was open space, there was commercial facility, there was facility for convention centres, but certainly a stadium wasn't part of that. And so that's one part that the council's role has. Should we go to considering a stadium, we're going to the Tasmanian planning scheme. So there's this very inertia-ridden movement to the Tasmanian planning scheme, which is expected to apply to Macquarie Point in late 2023 or early 2024. But as we know, the government plans as part of this AFL stadium is to, as part of the federal planning, is to have a master plan. And part of that master plan is how it will be considered, and it may well be considered as a project of state significance, in which case the council's role would really only to make comment rather than actually having the final decision. So there's still quite a lot to go through to get to the end of that process. It has to go to Parliament. And I might add that this has been so controversial that it has, in fact, made a majority government or two members of that government actually leave the government. So now the Rockcliffe government is in minority. So it's not without controversy. The other role that council has is to look at how Macquarie Point, in whatever form that might take, the 9.3 hectares, which is Macquarie Point, how that might interact with the rest of the city. And Mike's already touched upon how important those linkages are. We have, the council is developing an inner northeast structure plan, which is particularly looking at those linkages of Macquarie Point with the Domain and with the rest of the city. And that would include looking at transport options, land use, built form, the public realm and activation and wayfinding, to mention a few things. But just in the role of advocacy that the council has, I mean, this is one of a really important part of what council has, whether we're involved with the planning process, but as elected members, we're representing our community in its various forms. And I think the public interest in this project, it's many and varied, but the three main points, and it kind of touches on what you've said, Mike. It's that place, how special this 9.3 hectares is and that connection to place that communities have. So we know that the cenotaph sits on the escarpment and has had a very large cultural place in Hobart and Greater Hobart's history, and it has a direct connection with the water. We know also that from 1838 we've had the continued regatta festival, or like the Regatta Day is held. It's actually a public holiday in southern Tasmania, and Regatta Point, which is just east of the cenotaph, is a very important connection that the community has to that part of the waterfront. So too with the Aboriginal connection, obviously predating so much of that more recent European history, but that connection is really important as well. So it's that place and connection to place. It's having confidence in the process. Whatever the governance structure might be, it's really fundamental that the governance structure has the confidence of the people. And if we're changing from one type of form of getting planning approval through, then how confident is the community in that process, and how solid is that process? Do we just push aside the planning scheme? Is it new rules for this particular process? That's the question. And finally, I think because this is a prime piece of public land, and it is a proposal worth, I think, $750 million for the stadium. So prime piece of public land and lots of public money, both federal and state. And how is that governance and how is that process going to occur to make sure that it is fair, equitable and accountable?
Great. No, thanks very much. Thanks very much for those comments, Helen. Now, could we turn to you, Deborah? Like you were sort of an active participant for several years in this process. And
I keep saying to Peter, it's a piece I try and leave off my resume, but he keeps saying it.
Okay, that's an interesting one. But what were your observations? And we've talked a fair bit about process. Is that something that cropped up in your thinking, particularly reflecting back now? You've been out of it for a few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've worked in urban renewal my whole career. And I think megaprojects are big, complicated projects. It's easy to talk about a vision statement. And I think the problem with that is everybody's got their view on what that vision is going to deliver. But if you actually have to deliver a mega project, whatever it is, and I'm talking about the ones Mike's talked about rather than a stadium, they are layers and layers and layers of specialist expertise, from urban design and architecture to social planning to stakeholder engagement to transport to financing. That is a big, complicated project. And you can't do that stuff. You cannot do that stuff without good governance. Now, good governance means you need people around the table making decisions who know and understand what their role is in the process, but also who else they need at the table. So we need stewards who are looking after the urban environment for the future, for generations to come. And often we don't get that. And I guess I think even if you're going to have a special structure, you've got to actually have the right governance around that. So if you don't have... Oh, what did I do? Sorry, folks. I'm not sure what's going on there. Should I just continue to talk? Is that fine? So if you don't actually have the right expertise around the table, if you don't actually have people who understand their roles and responsibilities, so what is the role of the Minister's Office? What is the role of the independent board? What what is the role of the technical experts that you need around the table? If you don't have someone managing that process who understands the importance of informed decision making, then you have a mess. And then you have delays, then you have one master plan after the other. So, and I hasten to say, it's probably the first master plan that had all the detailed investigations undertaken, and the subsequent ones, which were less deeply investigated, are the ones that we're left with today, and trying to work out how do you actually deal with that. So from my perspective, it's all about governance, and it's an area we don't give enough attention to, because I can find good specialists to bring onto my team in all sectors, but people understanding their roles and responsibilities, understanding decision making, that doesn't happen. Sorry about the sound.
Okay, that's an interesting reflection. So you didn't get the impression when you're on the board and looking at the organisation that was an issue that was under control? Do you think there was some confusion?
No, I don't think people understood their roles clearly. And I think, to be honest, there was probably the independence of the board. I think state-owned corporations can work, and they can work very, very effectively. But that has to be when you have recognition of their independence, where you have transparency, proper engagement, proper independent review of processes. And I do not believe that that has happened in this case. And to be honest, you wouldn't be in this situation where you've been through multiple master plans if that were the case. So definitely.
Okay. Thanks very much, Deborah. Just going to quickly return to Jason, because you've been kind enough to give us the potted history, but you're a very experienced urbanist that's looked at projects like this in many parts of the world. Would you have any reflections in terms of your experience about what's happened at Macquarie Point?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I might share a paper with the audience just really quickly by a scholar called Ben Fluber. He wrote this back in 2014, and the paper's titled What You Should Know About Megaprojects and Why. It picks up many of the same points that Mike raised today. Mike did an excellent job of talking about the principles of successful megaprojects when you follow good principles. Ben does the kind of inverse. He looks at why megaprojects failed. He has something he calls the iron law of megaprojects, which is worth repeating today, and that's over time, over budget, and over again. So we see this around the world.
We've kicked the goals here.
We are on.
Ben will be overstudying us pretty shortly.
We are on target. And then he talks about the four sublimes of megaprojects. Now, for the audience members, this may start to sound quite familiar. He talks about the sublime of the political, where political players are deeply invested. Indeed, they can stake their political career on the success of a megaproject. The attractiveness of cutting a ribbon and going, ta-da, giant rail complex or hospital or whatever is highly politically attractive. Then he talks about the technological sublime, where a lot of professionals, architects, planners, engineers are drawn to this idea of it's never been done before, let's do the biggest, best, let's pick, say, stadium, for example. And how do we make that work on a really small site? So a lot of investment there. Then there's the economic sublime, where there's a lot of vested interest, a lot of key stakeholders and players who want to make a buck out of the project and are drawn to the project. And when they combine with this idea of the sublime of the technological and the political, it starts to get messy. And then finally, the aesthetic sublime, where this idea of leaving a legacy. Oftentimes it's not the legacy we would like to have seen, but nonetheless a legacy. So I'll give you a couple of examples and then some observations and I'll wrap up.
Sure.
All right, so he has an excellent table in this paper where he looks at cost overruns. So the Channel Tunnel linking UK and France had an 80% cost overrun. Indeed, one of the rules of mega projects seems to be that he suggests that you lie when you're doing your business case. And so to get this off the ground, what you want to do is you want to oversell its benefits and underplay its negative impacts. And so he makes an observation about rail projects, big rail projects, for example. He said typically they blow out by about 50%, and then you underplay the risk to patronage. Patronage is usually about 51% lower than what is talked about in the business case. Right, so we've got some problems already. Denver's International Airport, 200% cost overrun. Copenhagen's metro rail system, 150% cost overrun. And then my favourite, the Sydney Opera House, 1,400% cost overrun. That's third from the top, unfortunately.
Wow,
The Suez,
triple figures, go Sydney.
the Suez Canal took the cake, where that was a 1,900% cost overrun. All right, some observations. Bent talks about mega projects, and he said in the past these were projects of about $1 million. Then he talks about giga projects, about $1 billion, and now we're into terra projects. Terra in many ways, as we joked earlier, about $1 trillion. So I guess we're in the giga project realm with the Hobart, local Hobart example. Right, and some observations. I grew up in East Perth, around that area. I went to school there as a kid. The East Perth Redevelopment Authority was created by an act of government back in the 1990s under the Building Better Cities program. It was very similar to Macquarie Point. It was a specialist act of parliament. They had their own planning staff. Helen, this will sound familiar. They cut the City of Perth out of any kind of role because this was seen to be a strategic state project. But they did have a purpose, like Mike mentioned, and that was to showcase that it's possible to do density in the city. Perth back in those days was a bit of a donut city. It would empty out at night, the CBD was dead, people would come back in during the day to work. So the idea was to showcase that you can do urban renewal in the city and you can do it effectively, and to prove to developers it was possible. They were successful in many counts. It was profitable. They remediated a very contaminated site, much like Macquarie Point. It had a power station filled with asbestos. There were hydrocarbon contamination on site, this kind of stuff. But some failures as well. So, and I've critiqued this in some of my own work. The affordable housing component was meant to be about 12% of the site. It landed up being about 5%. This will sound familiar as well, Peter, from many projects that you know of, and Mike too. The open space was meant to be, well, certainly about half the site was open space when they started out, and what you left were a few pocket parks by the time the development was finished. All right, and then a couple of other examples. Baltimore wanted to revitalise its degraded waterfront, so it developed a whole range of tourism kind of activities, redeveloped an old gas power station for an ESPN sports zone, and David Harvey, the Marxist geographer, criticised it as being a festival of bread and circuses because it delivered nothing for the city. It was all about the kind of tourism spectre.
And when I worked on Darling Harbour Authority, we flew the Rouse team out to Sydney to give us advice.
And
there we go.
They did Baltimore.
They did Baltimore.
They did Baltimore, yeah.
Exactly.
So we see these stories repeating again and again and again. There's some common kind of themes here, right? And then finally, the Melbourne Docklands is another example that we might draw to mind. It too was meant to have delivered a lot of affordable housing, and at the end of the day, it hasn't. Instead, we've got a legacy of not much open space, lots of fancy apartments, and the community robbed of another really amazing site. So we're at the crossroads here. We've got a site as good as the Sydney Opera House site on the doorstep of our capital city, deserving of an incredible investment. The question is, what do we use it for?
Excellent. No, thanks very much, Jason. That was a very interesting review. If I just ask the audience to start crystallising some questions, because we're up to that point of proceedings where you didn't get a chance to interrogate our expert panel here. But we've given people the opportunity to do that online before the event when they registered, and I've just got a couple of questions I thought we should investigate. So I've got a question from Paul Johnston, and Paul asks, how can major urban projects such as Macquarie Point become catalysts for new directions for a city? You know, is that sort of part of the opportunity? Would any one of the panelists like to pick that up? Maybe looking at you, Mike. Or,
Well, I guess it needs to be really specific to the needs of the city, which I kind of talked about, this idea of, is there a deficit somehow in the city, and what is that? And these things sometimes have been identified through prior strategic planning documents. So it's actually staying true to some of that work. I mean, Docklands was mentioned. That was a classic example where initially the Docklands Task Force did excellent scoping work, stacks of background work in terms of what the city needs, how to extend the city. And then there was a change of government and it was just completely abandoned. And really just because there was a different ideological view about how to do planning. I really do think it goes back to understanding the qualities of the particular place and what is needed to do there and how can you use that site as an opportunity.
Excellent. Please.
I'm working on Tech Central in Sydney, which is an innovation district. Long way to go. But one of the things that it highlights is this opportunity to shift to knowledge economy jobs. And that's pertinent in every state of Australia. And how is it that we grow those relationships between research and industry? How do we actually foster the startup community? How do we bring the SMEs in? And that's something that I think Macquarie Point has a real opportunity to do here and to engage the right thinkers. But once again, it's getting the right thinkers around the table, it's getting the right advice, it's developing a strategy and taking that forward. And to your point, you can't do that in a silo, so you have to actually be connected to what's happening elsewhere in the city and the economy.
And I might add that part of the thinking is to have the Antarctic Gateway and the Antarctic Precinct at Macquarie Point. So we have the icebreaker Nuyina, which is birthed here, and it makes sense in that knowledge economy framework. We have we have the Antarctic Division here. We have the Institute of Marine and Antarctic Sciences here, UTAS. So these are really important components of what could be occurring.
Okay.
Can I maybe just add?
Yeah, please.
There's three things that jump out at me, Peter, that could be incredible legacies that the site could leave for the city. The first, I think the announcement that the site would activate ferries and a rapid transit corridor almost appeared tacked on by the government. But this site could really catalyse an amazing change in public transport in the city, and we desperately need an effective public transport system. The second one, the Truth and Reconciliation Park. I think people were really drawn to that idea because of the need for healing here in Tasmania, and it will be a great space to showcase that. And then third, we're in the midst of a housing crisis. Mega projects that have worked, that you've looked at, Mike, have included a housing component, right? And not just a tacked on little bit, but a really decent housing component. So that, to me, that seems like a really good use of the site too.
Okay, great. Okay, we'll do with one more question, then we'll switch to you guys, the audience. So John Lewis, who was going to be here but posted in sick, so asked this question. Major government investments like Macquarie Point have the potential to increase, or in some cases decrease, the value of surrounding sites. Okay, so essentially we're taking a very undeveloped site with a lot of contamination. I think Anthony Albanese describes as an eyesore, but he's not from Tasmania. Increase the value of surrounding sites. What is the optimal mechanism for trying to claw back some of this value that's been added by government investment on that site? Is there an opportunity for value capture in a mega project like that?
It's definitely on the site in particular. I mean, that's kind of, this New South Wales government have been trying to do this for a while and talking about it for a long time. They still haven't quite cracked it. They seem to be getting closer. When there's rezoning, that's the opportunity to actually capture that value. So of course, there's the fact that it's not being done when it's being done for decades around the world and still not here is just mind-boggling, to be honest.
East Perth did not a bad job. So they assembled a whole range of super lots, they called them.
Yep.
So the government showcased, and it was a really interesting intervention. They showcased the kind of density they wanted. They had assembled teams of really capable, competent people to build excellent medium density, missing middle style development. Once they had built enough interest, they then sold off the mega lots, and I think they more than recovered the cost of outlay. Whether it was a great use for the site, you've got to wonder, but still.
But the value capture often needs transport, and if you don't invest in the transport infrastructure, the opportunity for value capture is much, much more limited.
Absolutely, and there was a electric rail line that went right past the front of that site. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Can we throw it open to the audience? You know, we've assembled this expert panel. You've heard some interesting observations. Who'd like to start the ball rolling? Thanks very much. If you could just say your name, that'd be useful.
Chris Merridew. Just going back to the very beginning, and Professor Burkhardt, the question: have you been on the book?
I've been elevated. Thank
Sorry.
you. I know I'm in a
What would you like to be? Anyhow,
I'm a professor, but that's all. Go on, please.
I understand from the figures you gave us this afternoon that there's something like about $125 million has been invested in preliminary works. And last year, Mary Messina, the CEO, was running exhibition walks around the site. Now, am I correct to understand that things like water reticulation, for fires, for fresh water, for sewerage, for electricity, has a lot of that money been spent on putting that into the site to date?
I haven't been there for the last 3 years or so, but at the time I left, the investment had been in remediation and in some of the placemaking activities you talk about, but not in the reticulation schemes for the final development. I would doubt. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't been involved since, but I don't believe that the reticulation will be done yet. Normally that would be done on a stage basis as development happens, but because development isn't happening as yet, I would not think so, but I may be wrong.
Just not see where the money went.
Yes.
There's, from my understanding, there is still significant remediation to do because of the history of the site as a rail yard. So there's still more money to be spent, big money to be spent. Yeah. But part of the redevelopment, whatever that might take, is to remove the wastewater treatment plant, which is a significant part on the water's edge, which needs to be moved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks. Got some other questions from the audience?
Daphne Habibis. I think when I think about what we've been hearing is very much around understanding megaprojects and the dynamics and foundations for success. What we actually have, speaking as a local person, my heart kind of breaks when I think about this opportunity and what is probably going to happen there. And so I just wonder if anybody has any comment about what is effective in pushing it in a direction which is going to be much more responsive to what local people actually need and want. I don't know if you can answer that, but that's what I'm thinking about. Yeah.
But can I start a response to that? Because one of the things that surprises me is the silence around this aberration of a decision that is going to decimate the city and be there for a very, very, very long time. And the thing I don't understand is this plan is still on paper. While a plan's still on paper and it doesn't have a budget, it's not happened. So the opportunity to actually question and call for what is the impact of this on the city, what are the alternative locations that have been considered, how have they been evaluated, that has to be undertaken by an independent process. Now, whether that's a voluntary independent community process or whether it's someone appointed, but now is the time to do it, because Hobart is defined beautifully by its escarpment and by its harbour. And this decision, I cannot talk to one city-making practitioner who says, wow, what a great idea. I mean, it is just an abomination. So it needs to be questioned, and it needs a voice of people who care, because the stewards of our city are not playing the role they are supposed to play in taking care of the city for the next generation. So it's time for people to stand up, to find the experts, to start questioning on proper due process and proper independent, technically skilled review. It really is. And if this stadium happens, it will prove that the process has failed, and it has failed spectacularly. But you don't want it to prove it that way.
I think I think those are really good points, and it is about formulating those ideas of what the community wants for the site. This is public land, and I mean, Jason's right. There was a lot of interest in the Truth and Reconciliation Park, and I'll just read a quote from Greg Lehman, who's an Aboriginal elder who was involved in the process. Macquarie Point will be a place that draws optimism and cooperation from across the world. It will recreate Tasmania as a place where the darkest of histories are transformed into the brightest of futures. Macquarie Point will be where Australia comes of age. Now, if you look at that and you compare it to what is proposed currently, I don't know that you can really make that comparison. It's about letting people on council know, but also your elected members at the state level and even the federal level, because there's a significant amount of federal money set aside for this, as to what you want to see.
Thanks. Yep, yes.
Hi, my name's Robert Rands. I'm just curious to know from the chair whether you can identify anyone in the audience here present who might take a message directly back to some department in the state government. Is there someone here, either officially or unofficially, representing the state government? And I'm wondering whether you invited someone from the state government and what they might have said.
Yeah. There were certainly some people from the state government that registered, but whether they're here, I've got no idea. And it's not my job to try and shirt front a state government employee when they're coming along to a university event. But I can hear the passions are in that question. Certainly, this. Event's been filmed, so it will be on the public record, and there's an opportunity to share the proceedings with people from different government agencies, and I'm sure they'd be interested. Yeah, thanks.
Councillor Bill Harvey, City of Hobart. I'm just wondering if other places in the world have the same sort of process that we do in Hobart and Tasmania, where our debate's led by bumper stickers. So we have two, everyone polarises, and it's, save it and get on with it.
Yeah.
And, we saw that with the cable car. We've seen that with Save UTAS or Save Our City or whatever the, slogans are. But do other mega projects around the world draw the same sort of polarisation as we see in Hobart? And we never get around to debating the issues in Hobart. It's like, there's two cheer squads, and, just get on with it and stop it. And I think we just let ourselves down every time with these sort of projects in Hobart, where we just never get around to debating things properly. So what do you think? Other projects?
It's a really good question. I mean, certainly, even some of the projects I showed, there was fierce debate initially. But the point is that there was still due process, and there was debate that actually occurred, and that went through an established planning process. So even the New York case, the ULERP, that's a lengthy process that stacks of agencies, chip into and put forward propositions and argue, and it's very consultative. It goes through a whole range of consultative processes. But it kind of works in New York, and they get to a point where they do satisfy multiple stakeholder groups and communities with some sort of an outcome. And then that outcome is decide that's what we're going to do. And then if they want to change anything, well, they have to go through that process again. So you can criticise, Hudson Yards definitely has some things you can criticise about that, no doubt about it. But there are some fundamental public benefit outcomes that the city can be proud of. I mean, paying for the subway, 25% affordable housing, and then everyone moves on.
Yeah. I guess I make the observation, Bill, that maybe that intense for and against thing is maybe a bit of a reflection of more recent changes in the political process. Where and we've seen that played out with the referendum on October the 14th, I think, where people are just getting in opposite camps and yelling at each other rather than maybe trying to have some discussion. But go back to Mike's point, like to have decisions around large pieces of public property. It is like a complex process. People are going to have different views on it, and trying to embed that in a planning process that's sort of used to doing that is probably more likely, I think, to get a better result rather than if it's a special corporation operating under a new set of rules and laws. I think maybe a lot of people felt a bit excluded on that process. I'm not really sure. I wasn't here in 2012.
Or it may be a very tokenistic process as well. People want to have their say. They don't want to be asked a series of questions, yes/no questions, and you've got 25 characters to write some added response. I think that I'd love to see a more nuanced debate in some of these discussions that we should be having as a community, what we need as our city and beyond for our region. So bring it on, when can we get to that point where we do have that informed discussion and decision making?
I guess at that point I might put Deborah on the spot a little bit, because you've talked about the stadium. What do you think happens to urban regeneration areas when they stick a stadium in the middle of it? What tends to be the impact on the sort of built form around it?
You only have to be a tourist in a city. Beijing, go and see the famous Bird's Nest Stadium. Go to Sydney. They sanitise and sterilise areas around them for metres, if not hundreds of metres and kilometres. And the reason is, operationally, they need that space for their peak moments. Now, those peak moments might be, what's this one going to be, 10 big events a year and other smaller conferences, but it is going to sanitise an area the way that stadiums do the whole globe, that is going to actually stifle any activation. We talk about activate and a diverse place. Obviously the stadium doesn't satisfy any of the criteria in the vision, but if you just take those, the stadium is going to sanitise and sterilise an area that should be the lifeblood of Hobart going forward. And I think you only have to travel to a couple of cities and look at stadiums elsewhere. Locally, Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, the new stadium in Perth. I come from Perth originally as well. That's the same thing. So not a good solution for urban revitalisation and urban renewal.
Peter, can I just...
Sure.
I think Bill raised an excellent point that I want to just speak
Jason.
a little bit to as well. I think it's important to look at power relationships when we look at these big development projects, and that's certainly what David Harvey was doing in Baltimore. East Perth resulted in the displacement of a lot of Aboriginal people who used to live in East Perth, who had really strong connections with the site. And it resulted in displacement of a lot of migrant communities and people who depended on the sort of employment opportunities of the light industrial work that was around that site. What was left later was a fairly sanitised site of medium income, upper income housing with beautified little pocket parks, but not much there for the broader community. And I think we can look at many redevelopment projects, Pyrmont Ultimo and other projects around Australia, and you get similar outcomes.
Impact of the casino on Pyrmont has been substantial too.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, it's Alderman Bloomfield. It was really interesting listening to all of you. There was a key term that I really quite liked, the stewardship. The stewardship being that these were the people who represented the community and gained and kept the trust of the community and represented them. I'm not suggesting necessarily that that's actually elected members. It could be any individual professional that has gained that trust. But I do see that perhaps that's possibly where we're falling down. And particularly watching what has happened with these major projects and trying to understand, how did we get here? We had Macquarie Point, we were developing things, it was looking like we were getting somewhere, and then suddenly there was a great shift There was minimal consultation, and suddenly we had a completely new plan. Where was the stewardship? There was none. And in fact, we're finding that, Councillor Burnett had said, we become siloed. It's like, no, we'll actually keep the stewards out because we don't need to be having community involved in this. They aren't of value. And I actually find that is probably where most of this is falling, and this is perhaps where we really should be focusing to push for the change, because if we bring the community with us, then whatever project you want will just simply innately transpire over time. It will evolve. That's what communities do. But without that integrity, without that trust and stewardship, this is what we have.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you. John Wadsley. I'm a heritage consultant, but I'm really here as a member of the Friends of Soldiers Memorial Avenue on the Queen's Domain. We've been a very active community group over the last 23 years. I suppose our concern, we said in April when they announced this, that we were against Macquarie Point as a site, primarily because of the significant impacts on the heritage values of the cenotaph, which is a state heritage listed place, which also includes parts of the Soldiers Avenue. If Macquarie Point owns land to within 65 metres of the cenotaph itself, they're saying that they won't go within about 90 metres of the cenotaph. I did some Googling, and if you look at the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne, the nearest building on St Kilda Road is 250 metres away. I think if Gil McLaughlin had suggested putting a 40-metre stadium within 90 metres of the shrine, he probably would have had something cut off and they would have been buried somewhere. Because, you know, fundamentally, I think that a lot of people that I talk to, where the concern is that tail is wagging the dog. The government is acting on behalf of the AFL, and for whatever reason, the government think that the AFL are on a winner here. There seems to be a view that the AFL are saying you have to have a stadium within 1 kilometre of the CBD. And they're possibly basing this because in Melbourne, people walk to and from the MCG, there's plenty of public transport. That's not in Hobart. The other thing I've heard recently too, there's an interesting, let's call it a conspiracy theory, that the AFL never really believed that the state government would say yes. When they said, yes, you can have a team if you build a stadium, I think in Melbourne land, they probably thought, no, they won't do this. They said yes. They said, oh, okay, bugger. Okay, you've got to put a roof on it. They won't say yes. Rocky said yes. Oh, shit. Okay. You know, every time they've put a requirement on, the state government has said yes. With no business case, with no stewardship, with no consultation.
Have you got a question for the panel in this?
Well, I suppose, I mean, as a professional heritage consultant, I'm deeply concerned about the heritage values. And I was going to ask, in some of the mega projects or in some of your work, you know, and Jason's views as well, you know, is how does heritage come through in this? But also the other question is this question following what Louise said about the fact that we just don't have that stewardship really dominating the discussion.
Yeah.
Peter, can I answer the first bit about the heritage? So Lee Woolley, in the first master plan, established setback and height principles and controls. That was in the first master plan. So if you don't like that, even before a stadium comes, you throw that out and you do another master plan. But then the stadium comes, you pretend that worked. And that was the work that was really detailed. You just pretend that work never happened. So it's not like the respect for heritage is not there, and the importance of the escarpment and the cultural significance that Helen talked about hasn't been considered. It has. It's just that it's put on a shelf, another report's done, a better project comes along. Sorry.
Do you have any observations, Mark?
Yeah, look, I mean, look, from an outsider's perspective, this site is a gold mine because it's surrounded by cultural quality and historic buildings. You know, it's the ideal place to have a fine-grained, integrated cultural extension of a bustling inner city on the waterfront. Like, it's just kind of screams that just at first glance. But around the world it varies a lot. So in New York there's no height limit and they're going crazy. Like, it's ridiculous in there. The European examples, I mean, they're really wedded to their their heritage. I mean, that's why these new sites, the buildings rarely go above 5 floors because of the historic churches and town halls, and so they really respect that built form, and they don't build towers. They, you know, it's really integrated, and that's pretty common in a lot of these projects that I mentioned. But, you know, I mean, the debates that went on with Barangaroo, with the historic, highly historic sites with the observatory right next door and a range of historic buildings were kind of just, put by the wayside, and there wasn't really any authority, and there didn't seem to be requirements to, you know, listen or... So it's a very different and disappointing at sometimes process that we see here in Australia, unfortunately. I don't know what the answer to that is. There just somehow needs to be this stewardship and leadership, and where does that come from? And I still believe that it's better if it's vested in local government, because they're more connected to the place. They're more invested with the people that have, you know, voted. There's probably a greater democratic process that goes on. And, you know, not that would be guaranteed, but I'm sure that it would be a better outcome in that regard.
Do you have any comments you'd like to make there, Jason?
So Baltimore, they undertook adaptive reuse of a power station on site, but they put a giant guitar, huge guitar thing slapped on the front of it, so I'm not sure that really respected the site. East Perth, they grafted ideas of heritage from other places over the top of the Aboriginal heritage. So they put in a bunch of stone monolith kind of things on the site as part of the public art, which was kind of channeling Anglo-Celtic heritage over the top of the Aboriginal heritage. But they mixed that with brochures of Clark Gable and Gone with the Wind and all this kind of stuff, right? So it was a real pastiche. The thing I picked up on was the Gone with the Wind. When I was critical of that development, because it was just importing ideas from other places that had nothing to do with the site. And I think what Mike has said really strongly, and others on the panel today as well, has pointed to the importance of place and the need to be really dialed in to what makes a place special, the site qualities and the characteristics that the local community love. So we need to be attuned to that.
And of course the scalability, you know, like it has to be to scale and to really make it work. But I think it probably goes to something that Deb said earlier. The process has been very emotive in a sense. You know, you've been put forward this idea of having a stadium. We'll get an AFL team if we get a stadium. So if we go back to principles of good governance and good processes, then perhaps some of these ideas might be thought through a little more thoroughly before they're presented as a fait accompli.
Thanks very much, Helen. Look, I think, we've had a good chance for questions from the audience. Thanks very much for your questions. I was just going to give the panel a chance for one last word, and we might start with you, Deborah, on the end. You know, if you could name one thing that's critical, or if you could pull out one lesson, or one piece of advice to, you know, someone doing a mega project in Hobart or elsewhere, what would it be?
I'm glad you asked me first. Possibly. I'm glad you asked me first, because I've got a feeling others have mentioned this and I want to get in first. Governance. Yeah. Governance, governance, governance. The right people, the right skills, recognising what their roles and responsibilities are, bringing to the table a respect for technical expertise and knowledge. That seems to have disappeared, and actually implementing it. That has got to be where we start, and I think I've got a thought that we need a company directors course for city decision makers, because we don't pay enough attention to roles and responsibilities.
Okay,
that's where it starts and ends.
How about you, Helen? What would your one takeout or one message be?
Well, I think we learn from what's gone before us. So we draw on the experiences, and you know, I've read Mark's paper or papers on Barangaroo, and there are lots of lots of things to learn of what not to do and what to do in that example. Sticking to good planning principles in the first place, and not being bought by the highest bidder.
Thanks very much, Helen. How about you, Jason? What do you think?
Thanks, Peter. I think a focus on legacy is really critical. So what's the legacy that this mega project will leave behind? When we look at Athens and the Athens Olympics, the legacy was a whole bunch of failed sports facilities that crumbled in place. The Gold Coast, on the other hand, with the Commonwealth Games, quite successfully leveraged the athletes' village and mobilised that for affordable housing later on. So, you know, I think a really clear line of sight across the legacy.
Okay, and last but not least,
Okay.
Dr.
Yeah, we don't have governance.
No, I took it from you. Sorry, Mark.
Touching on something that Helen said in terms of learning, it's a really interesting one because some of the better examples that I've seen around the world, you know, it's actually explicit how this project is going to be better than the last one and the things that we did wrong on the last one. And we don't seem to have that. It's this lack of institutional memory and knowledge that we don't seem to even acknowledge some of the things that went wrong in the past and how can we do a better job this time. And, you know, part of that is when I'm thinking about the people that are involved is there's enduring roles. You know, I think someone said this, touched on this earlier. You know, and one, there's a particular woman who's been the chief of planning for a decade or more. Before that, she was in the city council and, you know, working in a similar area. So she knows the system, how it works, and she's really a leader in that space and in these projects. So if you've got a revolving door of kind of CEOs and people that come and go, I mean, you know, it's a really big problem to see continuity and to see objectives followed over necessarily long time frames of these projects.
Okay, no, thanks very much. Okay, and yeah, can I just thank the panel, but I'd like to hand over to Coles to have the last word, which I think is very appropriate.
Thanks, Peter. Look, that was an amazing discussion. I'm in equal parts despairing, but also absolutely inspired. I get the feeling that your mega project story here in Hobart is far from over. Well, you're just beginning by the sounds of it. So is the Festival of Urbanism. So I thank all of the speakers here for their fantastic contributions to this debate and discussion here in Hobart. And I thank you, the audience.